She thought the betrayal would be subtle, a quiet whisper in her father's ear, designed to chip away at her legacy. Instead, the shove came hard and fast, sending her tumbling down the polished marble steps of the only home she had ever known, the air instantly knocked out of her lungs. Have you ever been so close to seizing control of your future, only to have someone ruthlessly tear it away? That paralyzing shock, where the world spins but your body refuses to move, is the focus of this story. If you've ever fought for what is rightfully yours, hit that subscribe button now, because this tale of blood, loyalty, and ruthless consequence is about to define what true power costs. The fall itself was agonizing, but the terrifying realization that the Mafia Boss was already there, watching her descent, was the silent moment that sealed her fate forever. The Villa Rossi was always a place defined by height. Not just the physical elevation of the sprawling estate overlooking the Hudson Valley, but the ruthless, tiered structure of its hierarchy. Isabella Rossi, or Izzy as she preferred, had been brought back reluctantly to claim her position as the designated heir, the only surviving child of Don Vincenzo Rossi, the capo. Her father's health was failing, and the transition of power was imminent, a fact that had stirred the hornet's nest of ambitious men beneath her. Among them, Marco Gallo stood out. He was fiercely loyal, undeniably capable, and absolutely convinced that a woman could never hold the keys to the organization. Marco believed she was weak, a sentiment he had harbored and now expressed with brutal clarity. Izzy had just finished a tense meeting with her father's consigliere, discussing the immediate handover protocol. She carried the heavy folio of documents, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the sudden, weighty reality of responsibility. She reached the top of the central staircase, the grand spiral leading down 3 stories to the marble foyer, the stage for all major family interactions. Marco was waiting halfway up, positioned deliberately, blocking her path with a look of cold, contained fury. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He spoke volumes in clipped, vicious tones about her supposed inadequacy, concluding that the family needed strength, not sentimentality. She tried to assert her authority, citing her father's direct orders. That was the moment Marco moved. It wasn't a push meant merely to inconvenience her. It was a savage, calculated strike to the small of her back, specifically engineered to ensure maximum instability. The heavy folio flew from her grasp, papers scattering like terrified birds before she herself pitched forward. Izzy was too shaken to move, locked in the terrifying suspended animation of free fall. She hit the first few steps hard, tumbling without control. The pain was immediate, a blinding flash, but the shock was far worse, paralyzing her ability to brace herself. He had kicked her down the steps she was meant to rule from. Then, through the haze of vertigo and the echoing thud of her body against the stone, the noise stopped. A shadow fell over the brightly polished marble of the landing below. Izzy was sprawled painfully, clutching her arm, her entire body refusing to respond. She lifted her eyes, blurred with unshed tears and adrenaline, and saw him. Don Vincenzo Rossi, impeccably dressed and dangerously still, stood at the base of the stairs. He hadn't just arrived. He was already there before she fell, watching the entirety of Marco's ruthless execution of power. Don Vincenzo's face was unreadable, a mask carved from granite, but his eyes held an unnerving, predatory intensity. Marco stood above her, frozen, his triumph curdling into absolute terror under the Don's silent gaze. The trial was about to begin, and Izzy was the evidence. If you are following this story of impossible choices and betrayals, let me know where you are watching from. Comment with your city and country below. The silence was heavier than the fall itself. It was the kind of unnatural stillness that settled only when Don Vincenzo Rossi was about to render judgment. Izzy lay twisted on the marble floor, the sharp metallic tang of fear replacing the fresh scent of the polished stone. Her ribs ached with a deep, bruising intensity, and the entire right side of her body screamed in protest. But the pain was secondary to the chilling observation of her father's face. Don Vincenzo didn't rush forward, didn't call for help, nor did he lash out immediately at Marco. He simply studied the scene, the scattered financial reports detailing the family's assets, the streak of dirt on his daughter's silk blazer, and the panic etched across Marco's face. Marco Gallo, usually so composed and arrogant, looked like a statue awaiting the executioner's blade. He descended the remaining few steps slowly, his expensive shoes crunching on the loose papers, a sound that amplified the tension in the vast foyer. He didn't look at Izzy. His entire focus was on the Don, desperately searching for a flicker of understanding, an avenue for explanation. He knew the consequence for laying a hand on the boss's kin was absolute, regardless of the perceived justification. Don Vincenzo finally spoke, his voice low and rich, yet devoid of any warmth. It resonated off the high ceilings, making the air vibrate. He spoke in Italian, the language of command and unquestionable authority. A clumsy accident, Marco? Or an attempt to seize power while the sun still shines on the old man? Marco stammered, scrambling to construct a narrative. He claimed Izzy had slipped, that she had been holding too much, and he had only tried to catch her, perhaps with too much force. The lie was clumsy, exposed by the brutal angle of Izzy's landing and the sheer violence implied by the displacement of the documents. Izzy tried to move, to stand and refute the blatant falsehood, but a sharp, stabbing agony in her leg forced a small, muffled cry from her throat. The Don's gaze finally shifted to his daughter. He registered her vulnerability, the depth of her shock, and the genuine difficulty she had in simply breathing. But instead of tenderness, there was only cold, calculated assessment. She realized then that the trial wasn't just for Marco. It was for her, too. Her father was judging her fitness to lead based on how she handled this humiliation, this physical violation. She had been shaken to the core, reduced to helplessness on the very threshold of her inheritance. If she couldn't even manage Marco, how could she manage the entire organization? Don Vincenzo merely gestured to a nearby aide, a man named Silvio, who had silently appeared from the shadows. Help the signorina to her room, have the doctor summoned immediately and discreetly. He did not offer his own hand. Izzy was lifted carefully, the pain flaring, but she gripped Silvio's shoulder, refusing to make another sound. As she was carried away, her eyes met her father's one last time. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod to Marco. It was not a sign of forgiveness, but a terrible promise. She knew with chilling certainty that the true reckoning had just begun. Her survival depended now not on her strength, but on her ability to understand the deeper, deadlier game being played. Izzy's injuries were confirmed by the discreet doctor as serious bruising, cracked ribs, and a severe sprain. Nothing fatal, but enough to incapacitate her and enforce bed rest for several days. Lying in the opulence of her heavily guarded suite, the physical confinement mirrored the invisible cage of her existence within the Rossi empire. She felt the heavy silence of the villa settle around her, thick with unspoken judgment. Every breath was a reminder of the sharp, unjust pain inflicted by Marco and the terrifying indifference displayed by her father, Don Vincenzo. The complications began immediately. Don Vincenzo did not visit her, but he sent Silvio, his most trusted advisor, with a message as cold and clear as crystal. The Dawn had decided to proceed with the planned transition meeting with the family captains, regardless of her incapacitation. This was the first, brutal signal. Her inability to attend was interpreted not as a medical necessity, but as a failure of resolve. The message subtly implied that if she was too fragile to stand up to Marco, she was too fragile to stand up to their enemies. "The Dawn suggests," Silvio said, his eyes carefully avoiding hers, "that perhaps you need more time to recover your strength. The organization requires stability, Signorina." The smell of the antiseptic on Izzy's skin mingled with the faint, expensive leather scent of Silvio's briefcase, creating an atmosphere of sterile professionalism that was far more menacing than outright anger. This complication was immense. The scheduled meeting was where she was to be formally recognized as the heir, solidifying her position legally and emotionally before the volatile council of capos. By delaying or canceling her appearance, Vincenzo was opening a dangerous window for Marco to consolidate his influence and spread doubt about her competence. Marco was not just attempting a crude takeover. He was orchestrating a subtle campaign to paint her as unstable and inexperienced, a narrative now tragically bolstered by her actual physical fall. From her bedside, Izzy started to fight back, quietly. She demanded the scattered documents from the staircase be retrieved. Those were not just financial reports. They contained the sealed ledger entries, proving Marco's unauthorized and highly risky dealings with a rival faction in Miami. Dealings that put the entire New York operation at risk. If she could not attend the meeting, she would send the evidence. But when the aide returned with the folio, the crucial pages were missing. The evidence of Marco's double dealing was gone, likely shredded or delivered directly to the Dawn, who, she now suspected, might be using this entire situation to test Marco's resourcefulness just as much as her own resilience. Izzy realized she wasn't just recovering from an injury. She was trapped in a strategic vacuum, isolated and deprived of her most potent weapon. The only path forward was to find another key, another weakness in Marco's meticulously constructed shield, before the family meeting sealed her irrelevance. The loss of the crucial ledger pages represented Izzy's first major tactical loss. Marco hadn't just attacked her body, he had attacked the integrity of her defense. Days blurred into a suffocating routine of physical therapy and strategic isolation. The villa, usually a loud epicenter of activity, felt eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the muffled sounds of important activity downstairs, where Marco was undoubtedly capitalizing on her absence. She tried to contact known loyalists within the family structure, those who recognized the danger Marco posed, but the lines were carefully monitored. Every attempt to send a message outside her suite was met with quiet, polite obstruction from the guards, who maintained they were acting strictly under the Dawn's protective orders. The gilded cage had suddenly become smaller, and the air felt thin. One evening, unable to bear the confinement, Izzy limped to the balcony overlooking the estate's main courtyard. The cool night air carried the faint, bitter scent of cigar smoke and expensive Italian leather. Below, she saw a cluster of high-level capos arriving, their dark cars gleaming under the sodium lights. The preliminary meeting was underway. Marco was there, too, moving with an exaggerated confidence, shaking hands, the picture of a strong, capable leader, the ideal successor. A deeper, more immediate risk manifested when she discovered a breach in her financial security. She had transferred a significant personal fortune into offshore trusts months ago, anticipating the volatility of the succession. Now, the access codes were changed, not stolen, just altered, locked behind layers of internal security, controlled by the family's old financial network, which was notoriously loyal to traditional power structures, meaning Marco and the Dawn. She had lost not only her political standing, but her ability to maneuver independently. The loss felt like a physical blow, a sudden rush of cold panic that left her momentarily breathless. She was being systematically neutered, stripped of her voice, her proof, and her resources. Her only ally, Silvio, the consigliere, was too bound by loyalty to the Dawn to actively assist her, though his sorrowful glance during his last check-in hinted at his awareness of the injustice. This is the point where the cost of ambition becomes terrifyingly clear. We are diving deeper into this intense world of loyalty and betrayal, and we need your support to keep these stories coming. We are pushing hard to hit that 1,000 subscriber mark, and every one of you watching and subscribing helps fuel the next chapter. If you're invested in Izzy's fight for justice, please subscribe and join the community. Your support is crucial to us reaching that goal. Izzy leaned heavily against the railing, her bruised body throbbing. She looked down at the men gathered below, knowing she had only one card left to play. She had to bypass the system, retrieve the full truth about Marco's operations, and present it directly to the only judge who mattered, Don Vincenzo. But time was running out. The midpoint of the conflict arrived not with thunder, but with a quiet, calculated intrusion. Marco, having secured his position among the captains and effectively isolating Izzy, decided it was time to finalize the takeover. He entered her suite late one afternoon, dismissing the two silent guards with a wave of his hand. The air in the room instantly chilled. Marco didn't apologize for the fall. He treated it as a necessary political cleansing. He sat deliberately on the edge of her bed, the movement sending a ripple of fear through Izzy, who was propped up with pillows, masking her physical agony. The scent of his expensive cologne was a stark, suffocating reminder of his proximity and power. Marco laid out the terms of his ultimatum, his voice smooth and dangerously reasonable. The Dawn is fragile, Izzy. The captains respect strength and tradition. You are smart, but you are not us. I'm offering you a choice, a very generous one, considering what happened. The offer was simple. Izzy would publicly renounce her claim to the succession, citing health reasons and a desire to pursue her life outside the family. In exchange, Marco would ensure her personal safety, restore her financial access, and provide her with a substantial, guaranteed yearly income. Enough to live a comfortable life anywhere in the world, far from the conflict. Take the deal, Izzy, he urged, leaning closer. You tried. You failed. You were weak on those stairs, and your father saw it. Accept the consequence of your error. The alternative, should you continue this foolish defiance, is a complete exile. No funds, no protection, no place to go. You will be erased. Izzy swallowed the bitter taste of defeat and the rising bile of righteous anger. The pressure of the moment, the realization that her father had sanctioned this offer by his silence, was immense. She looked past Marco's cold eyes, seeing the ambition that had driven him to brutality. To accept meant admitting she was indeed too shaken to move, agreeing that her fall had defined her destiny. It meant abandoning her family legacy and allowing a dangerous, reckless man to seize control, likely leading the organization into a bloody war. "And my father?" she asked, her voice raspy but steady. Marco shrugged dismissively. "The Don will approve. He values stability above all else. He won't intervene either way. The decision is entirely yours, Izzy, but you must decide before the final captain's meeting tomorrow night. Once I am confirmed, this offer evaporates." He stood up, leaving the silence ringing with the weight of her impossible choice. Izzy watched him leave, the shadow of his betrayal lingering. She knew then that she could never take the safe exile. The true confrontation was not about succession anymore. It was about exposing the rot Marco represented, even if it meant risking her life by moving when she was supposed to be still. Izzy rejected Marco's offer before he even cleared the threshold of her room. The audacity of his proposition had ignited a cold flame of resolve that finally surpassed the physical agony of her injuries. She knew accepting the deal would make her father and the organization weak. She had to fight. The immediate consequence of her rejection was a sharp tightening of the already rigorous security. The guards, who had previously maintained a respectful distance, now stood directly outside her door, their presence a palpable pressure. She found that the internal phone line to her father's wing was disconnected. She was a ghost in her own house, isolated from her means of communication. The critical sabotages, however, were directed at her relationships. She managed to use an old hidden cell phone, a burner she kept for emergencies, to contact her childhood friend, Sophia, who now ran a legitimate but highly sensitive, family-owned logistics company that often intersected with the organization's needs. Izzy needed Sophia to access records outside the Don's immediate grasp. When Sophia answered, the connection was staticky, but her voice was tight with fear. "Izzy, I can't talk. They've been asking questions. About you, about my father's books." Sophia paused, the sound of a closing door muffling her voice. "Marco has painted you as the source of instability. He's telling everyone you betrayed the family by exposing finances to outsiders. He said you were a risk to the whole structure." The betrayal stung worse than her physical injuries. Marco was systematically destroying her credibility, turning her closest confidants into frightened adversaries. Sophia abruptly disconnected, a clear signal that the mere act of speaking to Izzy now constituted a dangerous liability. Izzy understood that Marco hadn't just sabotaged her, he was turning her world toxic, forcing everyone to choose between him and her. The violation extended even into the supposed sanctuary of her suite. Late that night, she woke to the chilling sound of soft, almost imperceptible clicking near her desk. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. She remained perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, listening intently. The faint scent of stale cigarette smoke, Marco's preferred brand, wafted in the air. Someone had been in her room, carefully searching for any remaining evidence or communication devices. When the intruder finally slipped away, Izzy waited 10 agonizing minutes before forcing herself to move. She checked her belongings. Nothing obvious was missing, but the chilling realization was that Marco was confident enough to breach her personal space, protected only by her father's nominal authority. The threat was no longer distant, it was breathing down her neck, using the very guards meant to protect her. She had less than 24 hours until the final meeting, and she had to leave the villa, severely injured, or be permanently erased. With the final captain's meeting set for the following night, the deadline Marco had imposed, Izzy knew a direct confrontation was impossible. She was a cripple attempting to outmaneuver a fully resourced internal army. Her only option was to execute a surgical strike for evidence and present it at the 11th hour. The critical piece of leverage wasn't the stolen ledger pages, but the existence of a highly encrypted backup server housed in the villa's ancient wine cellar, a server only her father and secretly she knew about. This server contained every transaction, every dirty secret, including the full details of Marco's unauthorized Miami dealings and his attempts to frame her. The preparation was agonizingly slow due to her sprained leg and cracked ribs. She relied on the detailed architectural schematics she had memorized as a child, focusing on the hidden utility corridors that ran behind the kitchen staff's quarters. She needed to move unseen, and she needed tools. Izzy had always kept a small, nondescript box of emergency gear hidden behind a loose panel in her bathroom. A lock-picking set, a miniature toolkit, and a clean, fresh uniform belonging to a low-level cleaning staff member. The latter was crucial. Disguise was her best weapon against the pervasive security cameras and the vigilant eyes of Marco's men. The plan was a tactical nightmare, demanding extreme silence and speed. She had to wait for the shift change at 2 a.m., the time when surveillance was typically at its lowest ebb and the guards were complacent. She smeared theatrical makeup over the heavy bruising on her face, masking the trauma of the fall, and carefully donned the ill-fitting staff uniform. Every movement sent a searing jolt of pain through her ribs, and the smell of the damp linen of the uniform made her feel sick. But she pushed through. Her deadline was sharp and unyielding. 10 p.m. the following night, when the capos would gather in the dining hall for the vote. She had to retrieve the data, find a neutral party to witness it, and get the information to her father. We appreciate you sticking with Izzy's struggle as she fights against impossible odds. Remember, all this content is free for you to watch, but we need your help to grow our channel and keep delivering more intense stories like this one. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers, and every person who clicks that subscribe button helps us get there. Help us reach our goal so we can bring you even more high-quality videos. She took a deep, shaky breath, tested her weight on her injured leg, and grabbed the lock-picking kit. It was time to descend, not down the grand, fatal staircase, but through the dark, cramped tunnels of necessity. The fall had exposed her vulnerability. Now, she would use the shadows to expose their betrayal. At 2:05 a.m., Izzy slipped out of her suite, moving like a shadow despite the rhythmic throb in her side. The utility corridor was cramped and smelled heavily of industrial cleaner and stale cooking oil, a stark contrast to the perfumed upper floors. Her disguise worked perfectly. The few security personnel she encountered barely glanced at the cleaning lady, moving slowly, with a heavy limp. The true struggle was managing the physical exertion. Every flex of muscle felt like tearing sutures, and the cold, dense air in the lower levels made her breathing shallow and painful. She reached the massive steel door leading to the cellars. The lock was an antique, complex mechanism, but Izzy had practiced on similar locks since she was a teenager, a skill taught to her by her protective uncle, now deceased. She worked silently, the small clicks of the tumbler echoing loudly in the oppressive silence of the basement hallway. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the theatrical makeup, making her skin feel clammy and hot. Just as the final pin snapped into place, a sudden loud crack of electricity overhead plunged the hallway into complete darkness. Izzy froze, her heart leaping. The electricity failure was too sudden, too perfect to be accidental. It was a crisis signal. Marco knew she was moving, or at least he was escalating security measures across the board in anticipation of any desperate move. The door was unlocked, but the darkness was absolute. She fumbled for the small, low-powered flashlight in her pocket, its beam barely cutting through the blackness. Ahead, she could smell the earthy, humid air of the wine cellar, overlaid with the metallic scent of old machinery. The server room was just beyond the aging oak barrels. As she entered the cellar, navigating the uneven stone floor, The sound of heavy footsteps reverberated from the far end. They were not the slow, rhythmic steps of a patrol guard. These were hurried, aggressive strides. Someone was already down there. Izzy pressed herself against a colossal barrel, the rough wood scraping against her uniform. The steps grew closer, accompanied by the distinct sound of a handheld radio crackling with hurried Italian commands. She realized with sickening certainty that Marco's men were sweeping the cellar, not just as a precaution, but because they had tracked her movements, perhaps through her earlier desperate attempts at contact. A voice, low and gruff, echoed near her position. "Check behind the Bordeaux. The capo ordered a full lockdown. Nothing leaves this place tonight." The cold, humid air seemed to suffocate her. Izzy was trapped between the thick stone wall and the massive wooden barrel. She had broken cover, but she was moments away from being discovered, her mission failing just yards from her objective. The invasion was complete. Izzy held her breath, listening to the heavy footsteps scrape past the barrel she was hiding behind. The guards' flashlights cut erratic, powerful beams through the wine cellar, momentarily illuminating dusty bottles and thick spider webs. She could feel the vibration of their movements through the cold stone floor. The pain in her ribs intensified with the stress, making every heartbeat a dull, urgent thud. This was the dark night of the soul. Lying there, freezing and bruised, dressed in borrowed rags, Izzy confronted the sheer absurdity of her situation. She was the Don's only daughter, the designated heir, yet she was reduced to hiding from her own security detail, hunted by a man she knew was a traitor. The fall on the stairs had stripped away not just her physical stability, but her illusion of safety within the family. Her father had allowed Marco's aggression and then allowed her isolation, forcing her to realize that loyalty in their world was not earned through blood, but through ruthless competence. She thought about Marco's smug ultimatum, the comfortable exile. It was the easy way out, the path of survival. Why was she fighting so fiercely to inherit a kingdom built on violence and paranoia? The answer hit her with the clarity of despair. It wasn't about the power or the money anymore. It was about defining herself. If she retreated now, Marco would win, and she would forever be the weak one, the one who was too shaken to move. She would be defined by the moment she fell, not by her choice to stand back up. The true definition of power in the Rossi family was not physical aggression, but strategic truth. Marco was using force and fabrication. Her strength lay in undeniable evidence. If she could expose his recklessness, his dangerous dealings with rivals that threatened the core stability of the family, she would appeal to the one thing her father valued above all else: control and longevity. The footsteps receded into the back of the cellar, towards the main refrigeration unit. Izzy seized the moment. She couldn't wait any longer. Ignoring the protests of her body, she pushed off the wall, staggering slightly, and moved toward the hidden server room. She didn't have a plan for escape, only a desperate commitment to obtain the proof. Her fear had been replaced by a fierce, driving necessity. She was no longer fighting to win. She was fighting not to lose herself. Izzy reached the recessed panel behind the oldest rack of Chianti. Her fingers, numb with cold and tension, fumbled with the hidden release. The panel slid open with a soft, metallic scrape, revealing the small climate-controlled server housing the organization's true records. She quickly inserted the miniature thumb drive she had smuggled in and began the download. The progress bar crawled agonizingly slow, each percentage point feeling like a lifetime. Suddenly the server room door, which she had failed to fully secure, burst open. Marco stood framed in the dim light, his face contorted in a mask of triumph and absolute rage. He had circled back, anticipating her target. "You should have taken the deal, Izzy," Marco hissed, advancing slowly. "Now you get nothing." Izzy yanked the drive out just as the download hit 98%. It was incomplete, but she hoped it contained enough evidence. She pressed herself against the cold metal server, the pain in her ribs surging. She had nowhere to run. The confrontation was upon her. Marco lunged, aiming not for injury but to immobilize her, and seized the drive. Izzy, drawing on the desperate resilience of the cornered, sidestepped just enough. The movement was clumsy, driven by pure instinct, but it worked. Marco slammed into the server rack, the impact rattling the entire structure. Before he could recover, Izzy made a split-second decision that carried immense risk. She threw the thumb drive with all her remaining strength, not at Marco, but toward the entrance of the cellar, hoping it would land near the main corridor, where it might be found by someone neutral. Perhaps Silvio, if she was lucky. Marco roared, momentarily distracted, and chased the trajectory of the drive. He snatched it up, looking back at Izzy with a vicious, triumphant smirk. Too late. But Izzy wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway behind Marco. "Look up, Marco," she whispered, her voice strained. Marco paused, confusion washing over his face as he turned slightly, clutching the evidence. Standing silently in the gloom of the cellar entrance, Don Vincenzo Rossi appeared. Unlike the distant witness on the staircase, the Don had followed the noise and the light. He stood like a dark monument, witnessing Marco's final desperate act of theft and violence in the family's most sacred archive. Marco instantly dropped the bravado, his expression shifting to stark terror as he recognized the severity of his error. He had not only attacked the heir, he had breached the financial core of the operation in the presence of the capo himself. The Don hadn't needed the proof. He needed to see Marco's true nature, and Marco had just provided it, sealing his fate with his own panicked response. The final confrontation was a scene of stark, silent drama played out in the cold humidity of the wine cellar. Don Vincenzo did not need explanations or accusations. He saw his injured daughter, clad in a disguise, fighting for the truth, and he saw Marco Gallo, holding a stolen drive, having desecrated the family's ultimate sanctuary. The betrayal of trust in the financial heart of the organization was a sin far greater than physical violence. Don Vincenzo simply extended his hand toward Marco, his movement slow, deliberate, and final. "Give me the drive, Marco." Marco's carefully constructed world imploded in that instant. He knew the truth was contained on the device, and if the Don saw the details of the reckless Miami dealings, which proved Marco was prioritizing personal gain over family stability, his life was forfeit. He looked from the Don to Izzy, seeing the terrible inevitability reflected in her pale, resolute eyes. In a desperate, fatal choice, Marco made one last lunge, not at Izzy, but away from the Don, towards the darker recesses of the cellar. He was not trying to escape the villa, only to buy time to destroy the drive. Before he could take 2 steps, Silvio, the consigliere, emerged from the shadows near the entrance. Silvio, the man who was meant to remain neutral, had followed the Don. He acted with the precise, efficient dedication of a long-time loyalist. There was a swift, decisive move, and Marco stumbled, a sound of heavy impact echoing as he collapsed among the empty wooden crates. The drive skittered across the damp stone floor, stopping just short of the Don's expensive shoe. Don Vincenzo didn't acknowledge Silvio. His eyes remained fixed on Izzy. He slowly bent and picked up the thumb drive, his gaze heavy and assessing. He then turned his attention to the fallen Marco. The consequences for his cruelty and his corruption were sealed. The organization's future stability had been prioritized. Izzy felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. But she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to yield to the pain. She had been shaken and knocked down, but she had used the consequences of her fall to expose the rot. The Don finally spoke to her, his voice weary but commanding. "Get out of that uniform, Isabella. Go to your room. This is handled." There was no warmth, no praise for her resilience, only the acknowledgement that she had passed his ultimate test. She had fought for the family, not just for herself. As Izzy limped away, supported by Silvio, she heard the Don give low, succinct orders to two other waiting guards. They were the kind of orders that required no repetition. The chapter of Marco Gallo was irrevocably closed. Weeks passed. The transition of power did not happen in a public ceremony before the capos, but in the sterile, quiet atmosphere of Don Vincenzo's private study. Izzy, still healing but moving steadily, sat opposite her father as he reviewed the final documents. Marco Gallo had vanished, his name now an unspoken reminder of the price of disloyalty. The official narrative was that he had been transferred to a remote, critical post. Everyone knew the truth, but the silence maintained the structure. Izzy was formally recognized as the designated heir. She had earned the position not through birthright, but through resilience under fire. She realized that her father had never doubted her intelligence or her competence with the books. He had doubted her ruthlessness and her ability to survive physical and political assault. Her fall on the stairs had been a humiliation, but her defiant crawl in the cellar had been her coronation. The immediate changes were subtle but profound. Silvio, now operating entirely under Izzy's direction, restored her financial security and, more importantly, removed the guards placed by Marco, replacing them with personnel chosen for their singular loyalty to the Rossi name, not the Don's temporary favor. The villa no longer felt like a prison. Izzy did not assume her new role with joy or relief, but with a chilling, clear-eyed understanding of the cost. The trauma of the fall remained, a lingering ache in her ribs, a permanent suspicion of polished marble steps, and a deep-seated loneliness. She had won the kingdom, but she had lost the possibility of a normal life, and perhaps the last vestiges of her innocence. She sat in her father's chair, the heavy leather smelling of power and age, and felt the immense weight of the decisions now resting on her shoulders. One evening, she walked slowly down the central spiral staircase. The marble steps gleamed under the chandeliers, the site of her brutal failure and her ultimate triumph. She paused exactly where Marco had struck her, placing her hand on the cold stone. She was no longer too shaken to move. She had moved when she was at her weakest, and that had changed everything. Don Vincenzo, now visibly weaker, watched her from the foyer. He gave her a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the new reality. He had sacrificed his pride by allowing his daughter to be tested so cruelly, but he had secured the future of the family. Izzy had inherited not just a vast, dangerous organization, but a heavy, solitary purpose. She knew the work had only just begun, and that the greatest threats often came from within the gilded walls.